Now let's talk about the research process, the steps involved in research. If you've ever written a research paper before, none of this will be new to you. Now, the first step is for you to decide on a topic to investigate. And when you're a sociologist, typically when you get your degree, your PhD, you have areas of interest or areas of concentration on which you'll base most of your research. So let's say your area of interest is violence against women. So the study you want to conduct has to do with domestic violence. So I'm going to put that here. Domestic violence. That's the first step. I've decided on a topic. Let's look at step 2. And step 2 is a literature review. But let's pause for a moment. Is there a problem with this topic? Think about it. Yes, there is. It's too broad. What about domestic violence do you want to study? So you need to narrow the scope of your study. So let's do that. Let's focus on the long-term impact of domestic violence on children. I got to be very careful how I write here because my board isn't that stable here. All right, so now that's more focused. The long-term impact of domestic violence on children. So let's move to a literature review, which is step 2. Now, let me ask you this though. Who would be the focus of my study? Would it be children or would it be adults? It would be adults. You know why? Because we're talking about the long-term impact of domestic violence on children. So the people that would participate in my study would be individuals who have experienced or witnessed abuse as children or witnessed violence in their home. So the literature review. The literature review is a way to gather information to do 2 things: to support your sociological questions, to also inform your study, and to find out what wasn't studied on this topic. Remember when I talked about the American Sociological Ethics, Association Ethics, in which you had to recognize the limitations of your expertise? Believe me, someone has conducted this study before, but there may be questions, sociological questions, that they couldn't answer. There may be hypotheses that they weren't able to test. That's where you would begin. So as you do a literature review, you're looking for the questions that weren't answered, and that's where you'll start your study so that it is groundbreaking and original. Step 3, identifying and defining core concepts. So this is where you don't take your audience for granted. Don't assume that people know what you mean by long-term, impact, domestic violence. You need to define those terms for your audience. When you say long-term, are you talking about 10, 15, 20, 25 years after the violence, post-violence? Impact. What kind of impact? Are you talking about an emotional, physical, psychological, social impact of domestic violence? And are you talking about violence in terms of physical abuse? Will you include emotional, verbal, sexual abuse? You, as the researcher, get to define that for your audience. And what you mean by domestic violence? Well, again, that include different types of violence or abuse that isn't exactly physical. Now, let's move on to step 4. Choosing a research design and ways to gather your data. So now this is where you need to figure out the way to answer your sociological questions. So when you set up your study, you have a set of hypotheses that you want to test by gathering data. Here, you need to figure out what's the best way to answer those questions. What is the long-term impact of domestic violence on children? Now, would you go into statistics and look at numbers, or would you actually interview people that have had the experience? If you said you conduct an interview study, you would be right. So, an interview study would be the way that you would try to answer these questions. You would interview, let's say, about 30 people max. Grounded studies should have between 25 and 30 people. This is a qualitative study. You're going to interview them for about an hour and a half. Okay, that's 90-minute interview. You don't want to go too long because you don't want the person to become frustrated and give up on answering your questions, because if they only go part of the way, then you can't use the full interview. All right, as part of your data. So you interview 30 people for 1.5 hours. At the end of that interview, you may have 4 hours of transcription for each interview. So that means that you're going to type every single word that they said and include the notes that you took, because they're making observations as they answer questions, because their nonverbal cues is data also. And then at the end of that, you may have 30 pages per person, per interview. So if we multiply 30 times 30, what do we get? 900 pages of data. That's a lot of information. So what do you do next after you've kind of finished your study, 120 hours of transcription, 900 pages of information? That's your data. The next step is for you to analyze the data and draw conclusions. So you need to analyze this information now. What are you looking for? First of all, you had some sociological questions that were part of your study. You try to farm that data or mine that data, M-I-N-E, so that you can get information from those interviews to answer your sociological questions. You might look for similar experiences and similar outcomes. If you are interviewing 15 females and 15 males who as adults remember growing up in a violent home, as they recall their experiences, what has been the consequence of that? How were their experiences similar? How were they different? Those are some of the things that you would interpret. And after you analyze your data and draw your conclusions, you now write up your report. And now it's time, step 6, to report your findings. And there are a number of ways you can do that. You can present a paper and you can write a paper and present it at a sociological conference to an audience full of sociologists that have research backgrounds on family violence, domestic violence, and get their feedback on your paper. Then you might submit that paper to a journal for publication, to a peer-reviewed scholastic journal, so that it might be published. Or if you want to reach a larger audience, you can also publish your findings in a book. So if you write a dissertation for your PhD, you might then take your PhD and convert it into a book that the rest of society can read. And once you do that, you have a larger audience that can appreciate the results of your findings. Again, part of your ethics is that you want your knowledge to contribute to the public good. So one of the ways that sociologists get their information out there is that they write a book for a mainstream, non-sociological audience. This is what I did for my PhD dissertation. Now, I'm not trying to plug my book, but I'm showing you what I did. So based on my dissertation, which focused on media's treatment of African American women as victims of homicide, I wrote a book called You're Dead, So What? Media, Police, and the Invisibility of Black Women as Victims of Homicide. So I took my PhD dissertation, which probably wouldn't be read by more than a few people, and I converted that into a book. And therefore, it reaches a larger audience. So those are the steps of research.